I'm really, really excited today to have someone who has been in my PLN, my Professional Learning Network, for an awful long time. Always been someone who's been very happy to share and give advice. He's got his own successful podcast now that I'm sure he'll share about in our chat today as well. And please do check that out. Lots of great guests on there, including someone not too far away, but lots of great advice being shared on there too, so please do check that out too. I don't want to steal his thunder though. I would like him to have the opportunity to talk about himself and what he does and all that. We are going to be talking about computing today, the teaching of, leading on, how you can develop it as a strong subject within your school's curriculum. All these sort of things will be covered during the conversation today, but before we dive into all those deeper questions, it gives me great pleasure to welcome onto Tip Top Tips Edu, Mr. A. Colley, as he's known on Twitter. Some of those things, isn't it, Andy, where you know people have their Twitter handles rather than their real names? Although obviously yours is very close to your real name, isn't it? So welcome to the show, Andy. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thanks, Mark. It's summer holidays, which is always nice. I've been off for a couple of days now. I don't know what day it is already, so that's perfect. So I'll just rub it in for all you people with real jobs who are, still in full-time work. Well, I'm enjoying the Manchester rain as we speak.
Oh, I live by the coast, and it's not that nice down here either. So don't feel too sort of being held in by all the bad weather, and don't be held back by saying that you don't have a real job either, Andy. I know how hard you work both inside school and beyond with all the sharing that you do. But for those who don't know you, Andy, could you share a little bit about who you are and what it is that you do, and some of the badges that you might have, and things you do to support within the computing community, and maybe a bit about your podcast as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Northwest England based, in and around Manchester. I started teaching in 2004, so I am coming up on 20 years in the game now. And that was after a very brief stint as a technician. At first, I got a job at Matthew Moss High School in Rochdale as an audiovisual technician, having come out of university with an IT degree and no idea what I wanted to do. Started as an AV technician, and very swiftly the entire IT team left around me. So I was sat in the network manager's chair for a couple of months with my fingers crossed, praying that nothing broke, basically. And fortunately, a young gentleman called David Leonard turned up to save my bacon, which allowed me then to work as a technician for another year or so. Matthew Moss was a training school, so I was in and out of classrooms, seeing what went on, and it turned out I really enjoyed being in the classroom. So I did the teacher training there. It was called the Graduate Trainee Programme at the time. I don't know if any of that rings any bells with people around about my age, but I was on the job training scheme, got a job at Matthew Moss at the end of it, did that for 5 years, and then got a new job at St Mary's in Astley, which is North Manchester again, as an advanced skills teacher, an AST. So that was my first proper badge. And I loved being an AST because the focus was all on teaching and learning and sharing resources, going out into primary schools, secondary schools, running teacher training events. It was all about improving classroom practice. And that for me is my bag. That's what I love about the job. Was at St Mary's for 13 years. And during that time, the AST accreditation got stopped by the government. I was a lead practitioner for teaching and learning. I spent 2 years secondment to SLT. I delivered in what was called the Improving and the Outstanding Teacher programs, facilitated those for hundreds of staff, including things like going into a pupil referral unit in a youth prison and teaching and training the staff there. Working with a variety of colleagues all over the place. And I kind of got, sort of fell onto Twitter and found around about 2010, just as it was starting to, the ball was rolling, found a few like-minded teachers out there and started to build a network of contacts, which kind of resulted in Simon Johnson CLC Simon on Twitter. We were kicking around an idea about 7 years ago or so for a weekly chat about ICT originally, and then computer science, and yeah, he's kept it going. It's been going nearly 7 years now. It's been every week. It's fantastic. It's called CAS Chat, if you don't know about it already, which comes from the Computing at School hashtag, and he's done absolutely great things with that. I'm sort of tangentially involved. I'll drop in, I'll drop out. I've hosted a few things like that. Other things I've done, I've been a Computing at School Master Teacher. I've got various Microsoft bits and bobs, badges, stuff like that. And I've just moved schools to be what they call the Director of Computing at Laurus Cheadle Hulme, which is a fairly new school. We're just about to have our first cohort of Year 11s go through in the next year. I know this chat's supposed to be about leading computing, but being a head of department is something I fell into. Last couple of years at St Mary's, the heads of department there were 2 of them in 2 years, and they both sort of went off on long-term sick, and I was left again sat in the chair. It was never anything I wanted to do. I always saw my progression as going up through the lead practitioner, the AST route, and doing that, but I ended up doing the job anyway, and so I just had to learn. I had to sharpen my skills. I had to go out there and find out and ask questions and read books, and talk to people a lot more. So that, and the help I got through running the Learning Dust podcast, of having talked to people who are involved in leadership, involved in school-wide strategy, involved at a higher level than I was, and I still am. Just listening to how they do things, listening to their opinions, really helped me shape what I believe in terms of how to run a department, and just help me take what kind of a nebulous set of half-formed ideas and really start to crystallize those. That's a process I'm still doing every day, really. This is by no means an expert session. I've done the job officially for a year as a head of department, so I'm still new at it. I'm still learning, but what I've tried to do is reach out and gather a lot of opinions and ideas, and sort of start to distill those into my own way of doing things, really.
So what do you see then, Andy, as being the sort of key difference between a subject teacher, a teacher of, compared to sort of the leader of? What do you see the sort of being the big sort of differences between those two things?
Well, I mean, as a subject teacher, you're responsible for what's in front of you. So the kids in my class, on an hourly basis, rotating around, I am responsible for their learning. And that is an unbelievably sophisticated and complex environment as it is. Whilst as a head of department, as a subject leader, you're not just responsible for what's going on in your classroom. You're responsible for the quality of learning across your department. Now, it could be that your classroom is the only computing classroom in the department. But it could be that you've got a team of 3 or 4. It could be that some of those are non-specialists, some of those are specialists. It could be that they're old converted IT teachers. It could be that the PE teacher who is getting near to retirement has been bussed over to IT and is now ended up teaching computer science. It could be you've got no subject qualifications whatsoever and somebody's gone, you can work a spreadsheet, off you go, which I've heard happen to primary colleagues. So it's a really sophisticated or complex subject because the backgrounds of everyone involved and the makeup of computing departments all over from school to school is so wildly different. But it's that responsibility that you've got. It's more like being, it's akin to being a team manager. Go to sports analogies. You know, you can talk to Robbie Savage all you want and whisper in his ear and tell him about tactics, but every now and again he'll go out on the pitch and kick someone in the first minute and get sent off, and you're sat there on the bench, you can do nothing about it. And as a classroom teacher, you'll know that feeling from having mark tests. You know, you'll be sat there thinking, but I taught them this and I taught them this style of how to do it. And so sometimes as a subject leader, that can happen with staff as well. You can talk about teaching and learning principles. You can run the meetings. You can agree on your ideology, you can talk about pedagogy, you can run all that training, and then you'll hear something going on in the classroom next door and think, it's like we've never talked about anything. And then comes the difficult bit, because that's where you've got to challenge and support and walk that very fine line of, this isn't right. This shouldn't be happening. But what I've got to do is come at it and approach it with you in a way that will get a response from you that results in what I want. And that is so hard to do, especially traditionally with computer scientists, where, you know, stereotypically we may not be the most emotionally intelligent people on the planet. And there's a grain of truth in every stereotype, isn't there? It's something that I've had to work particularly hard on. I am not an emotionally intelligent person at all. It's something I really have to be aware of.
I think you're absolutely right there, Andy, and certainly your experiences mirror some of mine as well, both in the leadership position, but also as being one of those people who isn't a computing specialist by trade either. When I first started teaching, it was a very similar conversation. You know, you can use Office software, can you? So there you go. I'm a business and economics graduate. That's what my teaching degree's in, and all the rest of it. And so I've had to skill myself up over the years and on those things as well. It's really interesting what you're talking there about those difficult conversations as well, about how you get the outcome that you want when you've had those meetings, you've delivered the training, you know what you've made your expectations clear. Could you share it? I mean, we're going off piste off the planned questions here, Andy, but it's still good tips for people who are in these sorts of roles. How do you approach those conversations when you might be dealing with some, say, stereotypically someone lacking perhaps in emotional intelligence kind of colleagues? How do you approach those questions, and how do you get those conversations, and how do you get the results you actually want?
I hate them. I absolutely hate them. I dread them. They keep me awake at night sometimes. And so the thing that I try and do is, it's twofold, really. I've got to try and separate myself and what I think other people think of me from me as the head of department. I've got to approach it as the position, rather than Andy. I've got to try and do that. I'm a massive West Wing fan, and there's an episode where President Bartlett basically says, I find it useful at these times to think of myself as the office of the president rather than myself, so that I can make these decisions. And I'm in no way saying that having a conversation about teaching and learning equates to sending people into a war zone or what have you. But I have to try and do that, and I think about it. I try and put my head on in terms of the conversation I'm having it because I want to improve things for that teacher, especially if it's a behaviour management thing. I don't want them to feel like they feel, having handled a behaviour situation in a poor way, or in a way that's resulted in argument and stress for them. And I want to improve outcomes for the kids in the classroom. That is my number one thing as a subject leader. Everything else can wait. My job is to improve the quality of lessons for the kids in the classrooms. Now, sometimes that's through the lovely, let's all sit down and talk about pedagogy and feel good and have really good strategies for going into the classroom. And sometimes it's a case of, well, this wasn't right and we need to do something about it. So I've got to get my head in the right space first. Then I've got to recognise the situation that the other teacher is in. I can't nip into their classroom and have this conversation whilst they're trying to teach a class. That's not fair on them. And equally, I can't send them an email saying, can we have a quick conversation at catch up at the end of the day? Because if you see an email land like that in your inbox, you're dreading it for the rest of the day. It's a case of sitting down and trying to find the time myself to look at when would be best to have this conversation. You need to deal with it promptly, because otherwise it'll prey on your mind. But also you need to do it in a space which is private and which is away from the classroom, so that the teacher can have time to digest what you're saying. And then don't beat around the bush. Without blame, just describe what you saw, describe what you heard, talk to them about it. If it's a behaviour management issue, if it's something that stressed them out, ask them how it made them feel. Remind them of the conversations you've had previously in terms of maybe it's behaviour for learning strategies you're looking at, maybe it's the way that you've seen something taught, maybe it was the way that a lesson had been managed or an explanation had been given. Remind them about what was going back there and talk about how you could do things differently next time, and see what support they need for that. Just explore it and dig into it. It's not a blame culture here, because if you blame people, you get the resentment, and if you get resentment, you don't get the results you want. But just like with the kids, if you let a kid walk past you with their shirt out, if you condone it, you promote it. And it's the same with staff, and it's hard with staff because you're trying to build a team, especially in computing. It will normally be a small team, 1, maybe 2, maybe 3 people. And you want this team to be happy coming to work hard, and to get on. But I always find that the dread of the situation is worse than the conversation itself. And a lot of people, and I've had people say this to me before, say, I know you'll be honest with me about this, and thank you for that. And it's taken me a long time to get there, and it's still not there because I have to steel myself and work up to it. But I think we're talking about that idea about managing underneath, if you will, managing down people who you are responsible for. You've also, as a middle leader, that idea of the middle means you've got to be able to manage up as well, and you've got to be able to shield your staff from the rain that comes down from above, of things to do, of priorities, of jobs, to let them perform their best in the classroom. And the other aspect of the job is doing that without bitching about it to the people below you, because they don't want to hear it. You're getting paid for this stuff. This is your job. No. You put yourself up for it. You're in the chair. So taking some of that and dealing with it is part of what you do. And knowing what's important and what's not is something that I've watched a lot of leaders do, and I've learned a lot from. My filter is, will this make a positive difference in the classroom? That's my Occam's razor for when I've got jobs.
So having that as your North Star, I think is always a good starting point. How will it improve outcomes for children? How is it going to support the children in the classroom? But you're absolutely right with what you said from the outset as well, Andy, because you've also got responsibility for thinking about the well-being and the progress and the support of your colleagues that you're working with in your team as well. And I've been in similar situations myself. It's difficult to balance. You can hear something going on in a room next to you. Do you go in? If you go in, it will stop the noise, but that undermines them when you do that. When do you have the conversation? If it's end of the day, if it's in the morning, when do you do it? When do you fit it in? It's really hard. But you've shared some really good advice and tips there. I don't want to sort of repeat everything you said, but lots of things you've shared there really resonate with how I approach those, or have approached those things in the past. And I think your reference to the West Wing, I think as well, I'm a big fan of the West Wing too. And there are lots of programs like that where we can learn a lot from the leadership of people within those scenarios and settings. And Bartlett is a great example. I know someone else I really admire in education and respect is Zoe Elder, Full On Learning on Twitter. And I know she's a big fan of the West Wing as well. There are so many nuggets you can take away from watching that show. So if you are, I think it's freely available on Channel 4 at the moment. So if you're looking for some box sets to catch up on during the summer break,
that is the ultimate top tip. Go and watch all of the West Wing. Maybe not season 5, but just to go back, I was really fortunate early in my career to have some behaviour for learning training from Bill Rogers. Yes. And there were a couple of things that he was talking about. And at that stage, I was 2-3 years in, so I wasn't in a position to do this, but I picked it up and I absorbed it because I was thinking that'll be useful later on down the line. You want your colleague to know they're being supported. If they've got a tough class, what do you do? Do you leave them to it on the basis that if you go in, you will undermine their professionalism? Or do you go in ranting and raving and because again, same effect. They might show up for you, but you go, and again, that's not so. There's a couple of things that I nicked from Bill Rogers. Number one is you go and you knock on the door, you go in. Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, miss. How are you? Are you happy with everyone? Are you happy with the way everybody's working and so on? Because then it's the teacher who has the autonomy. I am here to support you, but this is your call now, and the kids can see that. Or if you've got a student who is quite obviously really playing up, and the teacher, you go through the door and the teacher gives you those eyes, the ones I'm talking about, though. Then you ask to borrow them. Could I just borrow Kyle for a minute, please? It's not I'm coming in to sort the behaviour out. I just need Kyle for a sec. Is that all right? Thank you. Cheers, sir. And you're borrowing them from the lesson. And then you're taking them away from that environment. And again, it's a case of you're supporting your colleague without undermining your colleague's authority. So for me, Bill Rogers was talking about doing that. And I thought that was a really, really emotionally intelligent way of doing it.
No, I completely agree there. Brilliant. And from a starting point of sharing about top tips in education, what I'm thinking as we're talking, and these are great tips, not just in a computing department, but actually for anyone in a middle leadership role, because these things happen across the board, whether you're teaching PE, languages, maths, what have you. These are common issues we face across the board. So thanks for sharing all of those. One of the parts in that question I was going to ask you about the difference between being a subject teacher and a subject leader was what advice you might go back and give your earlier sort of career self. If you could sort of write yourself a letter to your ECT self with a few top tips about a few things, could you maybe sort of give me three, maybe sort of top tips of advice, nuggets of advice you give yourself as an early sort of career computing teacher?
I'm trying to remember now. This is many, many, many years ago. I think the first one would be, don't worry, you get better at this. I was really, really, really fortunate to train in a school that encouraged us to make mistakes, encouraged us to try things out, and was supportive and developmental in how we got observed and so on. And I've been through systems it's getting better now, but I've been through systems which were punitive for new teachers. And I don't think that had I qualified in that environment, I'd have made it. I think I'd have been out of the game by now because I was terrible as a new teacher. I was absolutely terrible as a new teacher. I mean, part of that was probably qualifying. When I qualified, there was, this is when learning styles was still a thing. It was De Bono's thinking hats. It was all of this stuff. Yeah. And so what I got was a lot of really good stuff about neuroscience and understanding the teenage brain and things like that. But what I didn't get was a lot of solid grounding in this is good, solid, quality teaching. This is how to explain something. This is how to ask questions. This is how to get as many brains working as you can in a classroom. This is how to assess student response and follow up. So for me, those would be the tips I would go back to. I mean, if you look at the flavour of the month at the moment is Rosenshine, isn't it? And it has been for a few years now. But that was written fairly early on in my teaching career. So one of my tips would be, this guy just brought this paper out, go and read it. Go and read it. And lastly, and this is probably computing specific, it would be that learning to code isn't as scary as you think it's going to be. Just get your head involved, practice every day, do little and often. Things I tell my students. It's still daunting, and I'm still remember what it's like to be a novice because I think that's important for the students in my classroom. I have to remember what it's like to be a novice learner because it's so easy to forget as an expert. And having taught A-level really, really was useful in reminding me about that, because I was absolutely a novice in that area. But yeah, I think get to grips with the foundations of teaching. Probably build your network, like I talked about with Twitter and so on. Connect with other people out there, and get yourself in the game, get your head in the game with programming and so on, earlier than you did. Because then you can probably write some resources and sell them. Make a bit of money on the side.
You talked about teaching A-level computing there, and something that I should probably made clear from the outset, but obviously I knew this, but you're a teacher of computing, leader of computing in a secondary school, similar background to myself in that regard. I would suggest, and I suspect you'd agree with me, teaching computing, leading on computing in secondary is quite a different proposition to doing so in primary. Working on a basis that you would agree with me on that, what do you see those sort of key differences as being, and what would you say might be the sort of key focuses or foci for each within the sort of those differing sort of layers there between primary and secondary, Andy?
Okay, disclaimer. This is opinion based on very, very limited experience of primary computing education. And I think that is sad in and of itself, isn't it? The fact that as secondary and primary, we often exist in these separate bunkers. And the chance to get together and talk about how do we hand the baton from year 6 to year 7, or from year 11 to year 12. How do we do that? How do we hand off there? Is so limited. It's so limited. Everybody's time poor. We talk about it on Learning Dust every single episode. It's always the number one solution to all the problems. I need more time to do this job properly. I think in primary, especially if you're a computing coordinator, you're up and down the year groups. You've got probably a flexible amount of time allocated to computing. You may be sat in the chair trembling like a leaf because you were the person who could work a spreadsheet, or you knew how to plug the projector in, and therefore you've been given the job. And God knows, I have enormous respect for primary colleagues, because how you master all those subjects, how you do it, you might, if you're in a regular sized primary school, then you're probably not just responsible for one subject. You might be responsible for 3-4 subjects across the curriculum. There's a lot more support there now than there was even 3 or 4 years ago with the NCCE and computing at school and so on. Some fantastic curricula coming out of there. But for me, that's the main difference. Just that fact that you don't get the time to sit down and specialize in one area and really get to know it upside down, inside out, back to front, the way we do in secondary. And that is, like a lot of teaching computing, a strength and a potential weakness, because your strength is you can see how that connects up to the rest of the curriculum. The way that primary works project-wise across topics, and bringing in geography, bringing in maths, bringing in computing. I'm so jealous of that, because it's more like the way we work in real life, isn't it? We don't just, right, time to do the maths hour now, time to do the science hour now. It's not the way it happens in your job. But what you may not get then is that time to really dig deeply into your subject area and really, really develop your expertise on that. If you're a primary colleague out there and you haven't come across Phil Baggy PR on Twitter, and his website, codeit.co.uk, that's code, code-it.co.uk. He is an absolute powerhouse of primary computing. He's the first person I recommend to anyone who's going into that It's just some brilliant stuff. Free resources, lessons, evaluations, examples. He's an absolute master of his craft. So if that's where I'd start if I was leading primary computing. Phil's fantastic.
Yeah, I'd go along with that as well, and not just the amazing amount of resources he has available and all the rest of it. He's a great guy too. He's just so approachable, friendly. He'll help anybody. So if you take Andy's advice about getting out there on social media and connecting with people, follow Phil. If you've got a question, tag him, and not only will he give you a bunch of great responses, and here's a link to this and that and this and that and this and that, but people will see that and they'll jump in and give you some more advice too. Brilliant shout out. So yeah, I'll plus 1, 2, 3, and 4 that one. So thanks for that, Andy. Anyone else?
And he's an Ofsted subject expert, isn't he?
Subject
lead. So you're not just getting really, really good practice from a really, really good teacher. You're getting the official rubber stamp. This is what Ofsted are looking for as well, which always helps when you're talking to your senior leadership. Anyone else for primary? Oh man, Rachel Coulthart, Alan Suey. I've got go to CAS Chat, because I'm missing hundreds and hundreds of people. Go to the CAS Chat hashtag. There's so many people out there who are willing to help, and I think this is the only other subject I've seen that does this as well as we do is languages with Joe Dale. In terms of networks on Twitter, there's always someone out there you can ask a question to who will come back with, I can help about that. I can answer questions about that. It's what's really, really, really helped me, just having that network. And doing things like this, even if you have enormous imposter syndrome like I have on a daily basis, putting yourself out there, sharing your resources, talking on podcasts, listening to people, learning from people, and being interviewed, because it helps you crystallize your own ideas and your own beliefs. I've been thinking about what we're going to talk about for about a week now, just to really make sure that I am sharp and I know I try and come across as well and as clearly as possible, because I know this is going to be listened to by other people, and that real world audience makes you sharpen your practice, doesn't it?
No, absolutely. And I'd agree with what you say there. That putting yourself out there, stepping outside your comfort zone, regardless of imposter syndrome, which again, I still face it myself. You can probably tell because I'm stuttering a bit in my response to you, Andy. We all suffer from it in some way, shape, or form. But like you shared there, and I've loved your bravery and honesty in sharing lots of things during our conversation so far. So thank you for that, Andy. But putting yourself out there and stepping outside your comfort zone, like I said, is for me one of the best things you can do, because it helps keep you honest. You learn new things, and for me, often it's about getting better at getting better. So you don't just start at that point of knowing X, but actually, like you say, crystallizing your views. The ability to explain things more clearly. You might not get it right the first time, but the next time you explain it, you'll have had that chance to say those things and reframe it and rethink about it. Don't overthink it, because that's not good for you. That's not that healthy. But that opportunity after the conversation to think back about what you've shared is super, super useful. So no, we're on the same page there, Andy. But you shared some great advice and tips there for primary computing, and a few people to follow and to connect with, and so forth and so on. Have you got any similar kind of resources and people that you might want to do a shout out for from a secondary viewpoint?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to start off with a couple of non-computing people. For me, Adam Robbins and his book Middle Leadership Mastery has been invaluable. I sort of fell into a head of department chair, and I sat there and I thought, nobody's really actually trained me on how to do this. I mean, I've done the odd course where they show you a picture of a boat with loads of different people on it, all doing different things, and they say which one's doing what. It doesn't tell me what to do when I've got staff who have a grievance, or when I have a parental complaint or anything like that. And Adam's book really does. It's a great read, and it's done with humour and honesty, and it's also really, really practically useful. As well as that, I would go with Adam Boxer. head of science, and a lot of his blog posts about how he develops teachers, how he observes lessons. He's a really, really, really insightful practitioner. You can tell he spends a hell of a long time thinking about what he wants from his staff. And we mentioned at the start about leadership being responsible for the outcomes in other classrooms, and a lot of that is you, me, any leader out there thinking about what you want from your staff and how you're going to develop them. What are your priorities for them and for the department, and how are you going to ensure that they are prepared and armed with the resources to see that happening? Again, I am not a jump up and down, shout type. That's not my leadership style. That's not the way I work things. It's not me, and it'd be false, and you'd be able to see through it in a second. My number one is, I've mentioned it many, many times, are the right things happening in the classroom? Now, for me, that is backed up by a really robust curriculum. I'm a big believer in centralized resources, so that we're all reading off the same page there, and a series of teaching and learning principles that are our default setting. I do it with the kids when I'm teaching, and when I get it right, it's my best lessons. I call it freedom within a framework. With the department, I call it minimum best practice, because I don't want a set of teaching robots. People have to have professional autonomy. I've gone into sorry, I've not answered the question here, but I've got into
it's all right. It's all good.
Sort of philosophy, really, about how I think how I run my department. But people have to have professional autonomy, but you also need to make sure, and you're responsible for making sure the right things are happening in the classroom. So minimum best practice for me is, as a department, we will sit down and we will talk about how do we ask questions, how do we explain things, how do we model, and we will look at research around best practice. We will look at examples. We will read the pedagogy guides from the NCCE, and we will agree on this is our default model. So, for example, if we're questioning, we're going to use cold calling. We're going to do no hands up. Now, if I go into a classroom and I see a teacher not using cold calling, that's not me going, right, big cross on the... It's a case of, okay, they're using something different now. If they're using something different, then let's make it better than our minimum standard. Is this a more effective way of doing things than the cold calling in this situation with this class? If it is, fantastic, great, brilliant, do it. If it's not, then that's where, as a leader, we need to have the conversation. And that would come out in a conversation post-lesson in terms of evaluate. Tell me about when I came in and I saw that. Was that as effective? What did you think? Why were you doing that? And explore around the why with the teacher and give them time to justify it with me. And that's where we get reflective practitioners from. That's where we get people who think about what they're doing in the classroom, not just covering the curriculum, but how they're doing it, how they're promoting thinking amongst their students, how they're promoting engagement and participation amongst their classes. And my job as a leader is to make myself progressively more redundant. I want people who come into a department as an ECT going out there in a few years running their own departments. I want them going on to lead schools. I want them, just like I want the kids in my classroom needing me less and less and less and less throughout the lesson as I remove the scaffolding. I want the staff doing the same thing. So I have to sit down and think, and this is one of the big differences about being just a classroom teacher versus being a head of department, is I have to think about how am I going to put the structures in place that enable my staff to do that. Because you could just have a set of centralized resources that run on wheels, and then you're removing any agency from your staff and they learn to rely on you all the time. So it's a case of constructing and creating those with your staff, which is, we mentioned just before we came on, we started recording, didn't we, about bought-in resources, which can save you loads of time, but I would never just buy a resource and then run it as is, because I think that this takes away the agency from me, takes away the agency from staff. we'd at least look at it and talk about it and think about how we're going to tweak it and what happens there. And that's how I sort of think about developing staff. And then you've got to go to your SLT link, who's giving you. We've all sat in the meetings, haven't we? We've sat in the meetings where you sit there for an hour whilst you get a list of jobs given to you, and then you have to go away with no time to do them. And that's the other side of the job, isn't it? Talking to your SLT link, over communicating with them at the start and saying, these are my priorities. How do they match with, this is what I think from my position within the department. How does that match with the school priorities? Agreeing that and getting it really clear at the start. And then if they ask you to do something else, say, well, this is what I'm working on here, 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 and here. This is where I think my priorities are. If you want me to do that, then where does that fit? Where's the time from that coming on from? Does that mean that this priority gets moved down or what have you? Because there's only 24 hours in the day. I am not going to work for all of them. So work with me. I want to do this. I want to help you. I want to make it work. But this is what's on my plate at the moment. What support can you give me to help to slot that new thing in? And go at it with a solution. Or at least the attitude of, we want to find a solution to this, and I need your help and support in order to do that, rather than going away and grumbling about it. You've got to have the conversations. You've got to have the communication. Same with your network staff. New in post, go and meet your network manager. Go and meet your technicians. Take biscuits. Talk to them about what you see happening. Talk to them about how the sort of software you're going to use, the way you see the curriculum developing. Maybe ask their advice. This is what I'm trying to achieve. Are there any systems that are already in place that will help me do that? I started this new job, and before I started it half term, just before summer. Before I'd started it, I'd had 4 or 5 video meetings with one of the lead technicians about, this is what I'm going to be looking at implementing. How can I? What can I do? What can't I do? What's available? What's not available? And they just appreciate the communication rather than coming in on day one and saying, this needs to work now.
No, absolutely. I've got a question for you about network managers that I'll come on to in just a minute, Andy. But we started this question with me asking you about the differences between primary and secondary computing and focuses for each. And you shared some people to follow and resources and things for primary, Phil Bagg and what have you. You shared some stuff then around secondary. But what you actually did in many different ways, actually, Andy, because what you did was, whilst being mindful of you sharing that you have imposter syndrome, you've actually shared some great advice from the experiences that you've had so far, how you actually develop autonomy whilst having scaffolding and structures in place with your minimum sort of teaching and learning standards for how you approach questioning or whatever it is within the classroom, and how you promote those conversations. You've talked about how you want to make yourself eventually redundant because you developed staff within your team who can run and not run and succeed and fly within the classrooms within your department as well. You've talked about those conversations with SLT as well, who come with their long list of things they want you to do. I think you've highlighted a really important point there as well in that sort of conversation, Andy, about, and this is a great takeaway, a great tip if you're new to post. The SLT will come at you with 1,000,001 things, but actually you know best what the priorities are for your department. Yes, your SLT link will know what the priorities are for the whole school, but how do you balance that? And you in your role, excuse me, you in your role, Andy, you correctly identify that you need to be able to, as you said earlier on, shield your department from those conversations. You don't want to go out to them moaning about how hard your job is and how SLT are annoying. You have to cushion them from that. You also need to promote them to your SLT link. You need to push back against SLT. What you do with the extra things. You shared loads and loads of great advice in there, Andy. You also shared about resources, and there are 1,000,001 resources out there you can buy off the shelf for computing, as you can with many subjects. You mentioned those that you like to sort of tweak. It's a difficult balance to strike as well, because workload being what it is, you can't ask your colleagues to build everything from scratch. So working on a basis that you will buy in some resources, and you mentioned before we went live, Andy, about resources that you like to manipulate and sort of add your own sort of touch of flair and what have you to. Could you share any resources that you feel sort of lend themselves to both being helpful but also malleable, so that you can sort of tweak, add to them, tailor them to best work within your sort of setting? Have you got any of those sort of resources that you could recommend for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of brilliant free stuff out there now. I've mentioned the NCCE before. That would be my first port of call for anything, Key Stage 1 upwards for computing. Their curricula are really, really good start points. Again, I wouldn't take them and run them as is. I think you need to look at them and evaluate them and examine them. But in terms of if you're in a hole and you've just been given the thing, there's nothing in place, then there's your start point. The NCCE also, I think they're associated. Are they associated with Isaac Computing, or is that Raspberry Pi Foundation? Yeah, I think they're all sort of bundled together. Isaac Computing is really good for A level, and it's starting to work backwards into GCSE at the moment. I think again at GCSE, one of the best free resources you can get out there is get onto YouTube and get the Craig and Dave videos. Especially, I mean, Craig and Dave have some paid for resources as well, and I've used those, and they're good, but I don't think there's enough practice in them. I think there's one or two activities around a topic, and then we move on. Whereas I'm always really jealous of maths teachers and science teachers with their textbooks full of practice questions and practice exercises that, I'd love to use in my retrieval practice at the start of lessons. Sometimes I want pupils to spend 10 minutes practicing binary conversion, 10 minutes of silent practice. And what I have to do then is write the questions, because there's nothing like that I've come across out there. There is a question bank.
Sounds like you found a niche for a book. I say it sounds like a niche for a book for yourself there, Andy.
Absolutely. Is it ED or is it diagnostic questions now? You keep flipping between the two URLs. Diagnostic questions, that's a free site with multiple choice computer science questions on. That's really good. I really like quizzes. There's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot of good computer science stuff on there, and it's really good in terms of giving you information at the end of a quiz about which questions were worst answered by the class, so you can go over them, things like that. It's a bit like Kahoot used to be, except good, and not just completely disruptive to your lesson, and not just based on clicking a colour as fast as you can. So there's actually thinking involved with quizzes, which I really like. I have done a lot of work with Replit, REPLIT, the online IDE programming website, which will do pretty much any language you like. There's a couple of my curricula on there for intro to an intermediate Python for free that's available, all based around the PRIM pedagogical framework, which again is espoused by CAS Computing at School, NCCE, Raspberry Pi Foundation, Sue Sentence, who really needs a shout out for the amount of unbelievable work she does around research in terms of what's effective in teaching computing. And again, there's more and more and more stuff out there all the time. I think you've just got to kind of pick your poison at some stage. One of the dangers of computing is there's new stuff out every day. There's new stuff out every day, and as a new subject lead, it can be overwhelming, especially because our national curriculum can be quite vague at points. What's a digital artifact and how do you explore those? Well, you can interpret that in 100 different ways. So I keep coming back round to this idea of tips for subject leaders. In terms of curriculum, it's a case of be really, really clear what the pillars of your curriculum are. What are the core structures that run through your curriculum horizontally, vertically, and support it? What are the core ideas? I know Computing at School call it ICT, computer science, and e-safety, but within that you can divide those up as well. I mean, for me, one of the big things for us is data representation. And that idea of data and what data is, that runs from our year 7 all the way through to our year 11. And once we've started identifying those core pillars, we can start thinking, well, what do year sevens need to know about that? What's their core knowledge, their threshold concepts, if you will, these ideas, this knowledge that will unlock other parts of the curriculum. And that was a big discussion I had with my I've got an ECT coming in September, and we've already sat down and talked about curriculum. We had a big argument about what comes first. Do you teach data first, or do you teach storage devices and hardware first? In terms of, if you understand data, that can help unlock storage devices. But if you understand storage devices, you've got a sort of a hook to hang the data on. It's not as abstract. So we're really talking and having these discussions around what the threshold concept was for that. We've decided to go with data first this time, but we're thinking about, we've introduced this idea of having a snag list at the end of every unit. We use OneNote for all our curricula. So we've got a page for each unit, a sort of teacher overview page. And you know how you do, you sort of teach a unit in October, and then it comes to your gain time that you get in July, and you're thinking, oh, I need to redo that unit. What was wrong with it when I taught it? So we've got this just little column of snag lists next to each lesson. What could be improved for next time? So as you're teaching a lesson, or after you finish teaching a lesson, you just write a little note there. And when it's time to go back and improve that unit, we've got a list of what to do. That's an idea I nicked from Adam Boxer. So it's things like that in terms of resources. Using something like OneNote for departmental resources has been fantastic for us.
And it's a great platform for sharing and having that sort of what went well, even better if, as it were, in old school money, for reflecting on things afterwards is a useful hint and tip too. I think what you've one of the great takeaways from that little part of our conversation, Andy, there is where you've highlighted really both the opportunities and some of the strengths that the computing curriculum has, in that it is always changing. You know, there's so much new innovation within the subject. It's one of the things which has appealed to me throughout my career about the subject. It's not like English where, you know, Shakespeare is pretty much always going to be Shakespeare. I know we bring it in, English teachers might sort of lambast me. That was another hashtag, actually, which I think is really, really a great representation. You mentioned Joe Dale's MFL Twitterati. Team English is another brilliant subject-specific hashtag worthy of shout-out. But, you know, Romeo and Juliet's always going to be Romeo and Juliet, but computing changes all the time. So there's some real opportunities and strengths with that, but it also brings, in a SWOT analysis world, it brings, you know, weaknesses and threats as well, doesn't it? Because there's so much to sort of pick and choose from, and so your advice about being clear on what the pillars of your curriculum are is absolutely fundamental, because once you've got that in place, you can hang things off of that quite clearly and helpfully, can't you, Andy? So some great advice there. Thank you.
There's more and more things about leading the subject keep occurring to me as we're talking. I mean, something we've not mentioned is that idea of the options take up, because a lot of school leaders still put computing, still ICT in their book, which was a completely different subject. And let's be honest, was a lot easier. You know, it was a subject you could pretty much put anyone into, and you could get them through it, because it was mostly coursework, and you would work it with them.
And a great tick box as well for improving your overall sort of points average for your school as well, which thankfully has been sort of removed. But yeah, as I say, computing GCSE is not the same beast as your either-sided IDAs of this world and what have you.
So, I mean, there's a dilemma already. I mean, what do you do at Key Stage 3? Because you want the subject to be interesting and exciting and relevant to students, but you also want to give them a realistic taste of what GCSE is going to be like and prepare them for that. And with the best will in the world, the Data Protection Act isn't going to make anyone's socks roll up and down, even though it's probably, you know, GDPR is vitally important and has probably a bigger impact on their lives than a lot of the other stuff that you'll teach them. But it's not very sexy, is it? It's not the glamorous bit. So our student, you want to promote your subject, you want to increase uptake options, you want students coming into it with the right reasons. How many times have I inherited a class of computer scientists who signed up for it thinking they were going to be making FIFA? And you've got to manage the expectations while still keeping that engagement, that excitement high. It'd be dead easy just to lowball your Key Stage 3, wouldn't it, and get kids all and remove some of the challenge, put in a load of, fancy shiny bits that appeal to people, but then you're not doing the data rep, you're not doing the legal ethical, you're not doing the Boolean logic and the really, really hard programming stuff. I do for my sins, I run quite a bit, I cycle quite a bit, I've done a few triathlons and things like that, and there's a phrase in triathlon, they call it type 2 fun, which is, you're enjoying this even though it's awful. Even though you feel like you might die at any point, your legs want to give up, your brain wants you to give up, your lungs are trying to get out of your chest. This is fun, but it's type 2 fun. And sometimes when I'm talking to students about programming, especially, that's what I talk about. I talk about type 2 fun. You've got to learn to love the struggle. Because it's Willingham says memory is the residue of thought, and Bjork talks about desirable difficulty in learning, and the fact that just because students can do it all doesn't mean it's learning. It's about are they thinking hard about a problem, and that as a subject is something we have such an opportunity to do. There is such scope for hard thinking and real thinking in your subject in computing. It's just, how do we get students to enjoy that? How do we get students to expect that? Because nobody wants to think hard. Everybody looks for the path of least resistance, don't they?
Well, that is human nature, isn't it? You only got to look at any park and field. I remember Steve Wheeler, popular Professor Steve Wheeler, popular teacher trainer out of Plymouth University previously, often shares a picture of a field, and there's a path running around the outside of the field, but there's also a path borne by feet walking from one corner of the field to the other, because that's what like as humans we want to take that path of least resistance, as you said. You said there. I'm mindful of time, Andy, and you're sharing again some great advice, and I love the Bjork and the Willingham references there as well, with linked into the subject of computing. But I'm mindful of time. I've got one final question for you, which is about balancing. You talked a little bit about network managers before, and they are pivotal to access. Technology for teaching and learning is different to technology within a computing department, and so as children's skills progress, so the things that they learn how to do can create increasing opportunities for them to provide security risks to your school network. I remember 2 former Year 9 students of mine quite gleefully coming to me with security vulnerabilities that they had found on our school network. What do you do with those Year 9s is a question we could have a little think
sign
about
them up for the GCSE. Those are the ones you want.
we absolutely did. I say I'm pleased to see that to share both of them now work in computing, having done computing degrees themselves as well. Brilliant stuff. But network managers quite rightly often express concerns over children creating programs that can generate executables for a variety of reasons linked into security of their network and what have you. Have you got any advice about balancing security concerns of network technicians and the requirements of the curriculum for students to be able to sort of develop their skills using these types of programming softwares that can, again, promote learning ways in which they can sort of unpick vulnerabilities within a school's security, within its network, and all that. Have you got any ideas or approaches that would be of interest to viewers about those sort of conversations that they can have with technicians? I'm guessing a large part of it, and as you were alluding to with the biscuits conversation, is about relationships. It's important to have those conversations, and like you said, 4 months before you started role, having those chats about what you need and what you'd like, and so forth and so on as well, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I'm always jealous of my partner because she is a head of science, and every night I get to hear about how science is the hardest subject of them all because it's 3 subjects in one, and I wouldn't dream of disagreeing with her at all, but especially not if she's watching. But computing's weird, isn't it? Can you imagine if the English department had to extensively security test their exercise books and put in requests for them to be checked and installed 4, 5, 6 weeks before they wanted to use them? because that's the market we're in with some software. The reason I'm jealous of science teachers is because they've got a massive prep room and they've got a couple of science technicians who can wheel in a trolley with the Bunsen burners or the this, that, and the other, and they help the teachers get set up. I'd love someone to do that with like a suite of Raspberry Pis or something like that and help me get all that set up. But this idea of network security is very important. It has to be. But the bottom line is that network is there to enable learning. So this is the biggest thing I've learned through doing the Learning Dust podcast. It really is about communication, and it's a people business. It's a people business. If you're lucky, you'll work in a school where that idea that the network is there to help students learn is central to the IT support team. But a lot of the time, it's not about what you say, it's about how you say it. And this is something I've really had to learn. This is why I made a huge effort with the IT team at my current school before I started the job, because I knew I wanted to come in. I knew I wanted to use OneNote. I knew I wanted to use a couple of other things that weren't in their standard build. And so I started talking about how I wanted to use Teams, started talking about needing to roll over a team from year 10 into year 11 so that the notebook goes with it and the students have it for the whole of their GCSE. And just having those conversations saying, this is what I'm looking at and these are the problems I can foresee or the potential points of friction that I can see. What can we do about that? And I basically said, look, I'll probably run into a lot of walls. And when I do, it's not deliberate. It's not a slight on the network. It's just a case of I'm trying to find out what I can and can't do. And so I'm still running into those walls. I'm still trying to use things that I'm not allowed to use. But because I've gone at it from I'd like to work with you on this, and I'm going to try and pre-warn you rather than come in and say this has to happen this morning, then I'm getting a lot more receptive feedback from the team. The other thing, and this is the one that's usually causes the big sticking point, is programming and your IDEs, because they're the things that create the executable files, aren't they? That really flag, that really make your network manager start the hairs on the back of the neck start to twitch.
The spidey senses.
Yeah, exactly. I think we're in such an exciting time with that because of online IDEs. Because what that does is it removes the executable from the network, doesn't it? And it happens on your Replit server. Or I've been using at Key Stage 3. I've got so little time. I've got an hour a week. I've got so little time. I don't even want them signing into Replit, really, because that is a hurdle they have to jump over to in order to do the learning that I want them to do. And I want to remove that. The Replit don't do Microsoft SSO, single sign-on at the moment, so I'm going to save that. But there's a site called Online Python. And what I can do is I can pre-write the code, I can generate a link, and I can drop that link into the OneNote page, and the students can look at the code, predict what it's going to do, click the link, there's the code, run it, see what happens. Or I can write the code that's half finished, and then they can click the link and finish it off. And there's no danger to the network. It all takes place through a browser. So this, for me, is a fantastic solution. I'm hearing very, very good things at the moment about coding rooms from quite a few people. Now, that is paid for, but it's similar to Replit, except you can set up your courses and it does auto grading and it keeps you a grade book together and things like that. So you can track student progress. I'm hearing a lot of people really enjoying that because it seems more built for education than Replit. Don't tell David Morgan all of this stuff when you speak to him. But I've been big on Replit for a few years, but there are lots of other people coming into the environment, or other online IDEs now coming into that environment. One of the ones that I'm really liking at the moment, and this is probably sacrilege in the computing community, is I'm looking to use EduBlocks instead of Scratch.
What is that?
Number one, Scratch still kind of requires that sign in, and Scratch is pretty much what you use with year 7s, isn't it? how long does it take you to get the year 7s logging on successfully to the network, and then they've got another separate username and password for Scratch? We've all been there, haven't we? You can probably hear the frustrated noises coming over the microphone. So EduBlocks, no sign-in. Also, it maps much more across to Python. You can see the Python on the blocks. You can see the Python separately in the IDE executing. It doesn't do the lovely sprites and the animations and things like that, which can be really engaging for the kids. But a lot of the time, they spend all the time trying to pick a background instead of actually learning the coding skill I want them to learn. So I'm really trying to distill it down and focus on removing any extraneous distraction, because learning to code is hard enough as it is. That the cognitive load required to process one line of code, the concepts and the understanding you've got in just a single line is massive. So if you're then thinking about sprites and you're then thinking about coordinates as well, that may well replace in your working memory the workings of a variable, which is what I want you to really be thinking about. It's difficult. It's an argument I'm having with myself, because there is a degree of engagement in Scratch that you don't get with pretty much any other coding language. And so I'm really trying to think about, am I doing this for the best reason? And I suppose that's part of running the department again, isn't it? You've got to think about, am I making this change because I want to make a change because I've not made a change in a while? Or am I making a change because it will have a positive impact? Because the decision not to do something is just oftentimes just as important as the decision to do something. I've been conscious of this trend in teaching for quite a while, where you have to be seen to be doing something. I mean, we've all got plenty to do, but it's the same when you go into a classroom. What are the kids doing? Are they busy? And busy work does not constitute effective work. So part of leading the department really has to be, part of leading the department has to be making those tough choices in terms of, is this effective? It might be what I like doing. It might be what I'm comfortable with doing. Is this something that is having a positive impact? Or I've seen this nice shiny new thing, but really is the effort, the cost benefit analysis, is it going to be better than what we're doing already? So
I remember working with a school back along, and a largely Irish teaching community, a school in Abu Dhabi, and I had a very similar conversation with some teachers there, and this guy came up with a phrase that I hadn't really heard before, but it sums that up in one simple, easy to understand phrase, which is the juice worth the squeeze? And if it ain't worth the squeeze, then it ain't worth the squeeze.
I'm stealing
Andy,
that.
Listen, there have been so many takeaways from our conversation today. I think anyone watching this, stepping into the role, or people who've been in the role for some time, will take an awful lot from our conversation today. One of my favourite things about the conversation is, whilst we have talked about computing tools and IDEs and people to follow and all those different things, predominantly running through our conversation like a stick of rock has been conversations about teaching, learning and leadership, and not really much about computing in itself, which I think is hallmark to you, your professionalism, how you lead, and long may that continue, and we see that more of that within the profession. Great conversation, Andy. Before we wrap up and I do the sort of closing credits, was there anything else you wanted to share with anybody? I will obviously share the links in the show notes to all the resources and people that Andy's mentioned, links through to the Learning Does podcast, all those different things. But is there anybody else you wanted to do a shout out to or anything before we wrap up today, Andy?
I think the reason I'm sat where I'm sat, and one of the big reasons is, and we mentioned him earlier, is Dave Leonard, my Learning Dust co-host, who not only rescued me from a life of praying printers didn't break, but by inviting me to be a co-host on the podcast has really helped me kick on with my career and get out of get out of sort of the doldrums that I was in, really. I've learned so much from being part of the Learning Dust podcast. That I think it'd be really, really valuable. If you're in pretty much everyone I've mentioned today, we've had on the podcast, and I've learned from, I've listened to, and I've stolen their ideas, and all I'm doing is passing them on. So I would highly recommend, if you're interested in anything that we've talked about today around leadership or communication or effective working relationships, bump on over to the podcast and have a listen, because it's taught me so much.
Brilliant stuff. Thank you, Andy. And I concur with that. And definitely, standing on the shoulders of giants is something which has been really useful to me throughout my career as well. And so many people that I'm grateful to and for the things they've taught and shared me. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me on the show. And I'm sure we could talk an awful lot more. Let's come back again and talk in a year or two's time, Andy, when I'm sure you'll be taking on your sort of first senior leadership role around teaching and learning. And it'd be great to sort of see how your thinking's progressed between now and then. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me, Andy. Please do subscribe if you're watching. If you're not, then hit the subscribe button on your podcasting tool as well. But for me, Mark Anderson, Head of Education at NetSupport, thank you for joining us for another episode of Tip Top Tips Edu. Please do follow Andy, Mr. A. Colley, on Twitter, and we look forward to you joining us on the next episode of Tip Top Tips Edu from NetSupport Group. Thanks so much for joining us, and see you on the next episode. Thanks.